Hi, welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. So this week's episode is about radical emptiness, transformation through presences. And Amma, you introduced the presences term, and it reminds me of like Led Zeppelin's problematic seventh album, actually, Presence, which was all about the presence was the force and power of Led Zeppelin. So something that gave me a lot of force and power was just before the show, Caroline led us in a guided meditation, which I think we all really enjoyed. Although, Amma, you did comment that there was a lot more red wine involved than your time at the ashrams.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, welcome to the show. The only rules are three, and that's dress for radio, don't be boring, and always remember the rule of three. So I suppose the difficulty is to find out how to start a conversation about nothingness. But I think I'm going to pick on you, Amma, a little bit to try and unpack that presence angle a little bit.
Okay. So I guess for me, like, presence is the ability to be with any situation, whatever it is. And so the more that one stays and knows oneself, then the easier life is, really. So, and this knowing who you are business allows you to recognize who you're not. Kind of bizarre in a way, but you have to know yourself really well in a way to see that when you're not there. And so the word presence, sometimes it's used like leadership presence, or, in this way. I mean, that's not my understanding of it. So this is a sort of a recognition. It's actually not something that you develop even. It's something that you get to know, that's part of yourself. And the more that you can sort of stay with that, recognize it, there's a power to that, and that's what usually shines through. And the ability, and then through that ability, things shift in a way by themselves. That's my understanding, and that's how I sort of have learned it during my time as a monk. So actually, I mean, in my time as a monk, we didn't really use the word presence so much, but I find in a sort of like, if you're translating from from a cultural language into something that maybe works a bit more easier in the West, because emptiness is such a strong word in a way, isn't it? When we think of what does it really mean? Does it mean we're just, like, there's nothing here? But it can't be true, because, you look inside yourself, there's loads of things going on. You look outside in the screen, there's loads of people here, isn't it? So that's my little pointer. That's my little starter.
So I suppose some of the things that come up there is that an absence of distractions allows us to go deeper as well. There's taking things away, stripping it down to the bare essentials. Yeah,
until you get to know that place, and then you can go back into the distractions, because it doesn't really matter either way. But first, you've got to see it more clearly. I mean, that's what helped me. My time in the monastery was just everything got cleared away. So then I could actually just see it more clearly. But you don't need that experience. You don't have to do it in a monastery. Plenty of people don't. But my experience was through that time of actually clearing things out the way. Money, sex, dancing, singing. I had so many restrictions on my life. Money, but but actually
singing and poetry was such a restriction on my life.
Yeah. So, but actually, you don't need all of that.
Just, I think you'll find I do.
Yeah. No, we were restricted, not used, restricted. In singing and dancing. Yeah. But no, poetry is a powerful art, isn't it? Art is another way in. Even if we look at,
that's a great line right there.
Thank you.
Art is another way in.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Don't you think, Brian? Don't you think it's
I think it's a T-shirt. I'm a T-shirt guy. That's a T-shirt.
Yeah. Great. Let's print it. Yeah.
We should create a social e-com space that comes off these talks, where we hit a button, we hit the aha button, or we hit the T-shirt button. It automatically prints a T-shirt in a social space where people can rate it and talk about it and buy it, and then you get a couple of bucks to go to the monastery.
Yeah, that's right. We need to actually work on our marketing arm. That's something that you've hassled me about, haven't you, Brian? But I suppose something that comes out of what we said is that there's the taking away is actually something we neglect to do. I mean, it's interesting. Why do we neglect? Why is there that pressure to not take away? Why is emptiness radical? Why isn't in our what is it about the human condition that makes it maybe our default to not be empty?
Well, we're set up for conflict, set up for division, not peace.
Yeah. Maybe it's difficult to share as well, I suppose. The emptiness, it's being our true self. We're probably more prone to be criticized, or that's what we fear. So to show ourselves really the way we are, this coherent self.
It's an interesting use of phrase here.
Yeah.
Self-coherence is a phrase I've used for about 15 years. Uniqueness, as Chris and Lou and a couple others might know, uniqueness, which I spell Y-O-U, refers to the coherence of self through the manifestation of innate gifts. Yeah. And everyone has them, right? But there's no curriculum for this. That's what my life work is about, is the curriculum to help people recognize resonance. Resonance is the way to sculpt and to cleave off the symbolic, artificial sort of trappings that aren't you. I mean, everyone here has very specific innate dispositions, and we're all unique. To the degree that we have synergy between each other, now that's a beautiful thing to experience, right? For me, that is like a secular moralism. To manifest uniqueness, to live purpose and synergy with others. That's like, and if emptiness emptiness is the coherence, that's like everything from nothing. It's everything that you are. And guess, I know what I'm not. I mean, Lou and I, for instance, have known each other for over a decade, and he does things that blow my mind with his gifts, right? And Anne-Marie, if I heard you or your students sing, I would go, oh my God, But here's the thing. I have a perfect pitch ear, but I'm relative pitch singing, and I was never trained, but I can harmonize with anyone, right? And it's an innate gift. But when someone sings out of tune, I have a visceral, my body goes, ow, oh, that hurt.
Yeah. If I were to sing, Brian, you would probably say, oh my God, but there would be a different meaning.
But I think very often I put it in terms of musicality and art, and especially with this thing about emptiness and being, for me, it's to be in tune with yourself. So it's like tuning a fine instrument. You suddenly realize how to play it in tune. And that takes some doing. It takes some doing with yourself.
Well, we fight it. We fight it because it's the greatest task of all. And imagine if you failed at being yourself.
Yes. What's left?
What a joy.
You become emptiness.
So does that mean, Brian, that when we're participating in the everyday, does that mean that the lack of emptiness means that there can be the risk of a lack of authenticity because there's too much mental activity that's associated with something that's not ourselves? So is it harder to find ourselves when we don't have emptiness?
Well, when you don't know what you resonate to, and when I talk about resonate, I mean, it's a very simple thing, but it's incredibly difficult for people to learn that that's what matters, and so those that are stuck, our world is stuck in symbolic representations of self, right? So if you strip away the guy's Mercedes and his title at the bank, and you bring him into a Guildcraft meeting, right, where you work, Chris, where people, their false identities are stripped away when they sit down in those meetings.
So that suggests that actually there's this type of personal emptiness associated with the material world that we live in, and these symbols and trappings that mean that we lose ourselves because we haven't been able to. They're just all around. They're literally like booby traps, aren't they? Cultural booby traps that we're like running into and falling into without even knowing it, and we're trained in it. as well. That's the thing. Our economy is almost based on a lack of emptiness, because I suppose unless you're going to a retreat somewhere, it's difficult to sell.
And it starts in schools, doesn't it? It starts with the education system.
And your parents, I mean, your role models from birth.
Yes.
And also our cultures as well, depending on, whether we're in Asian culture, they're much more focused on the background, and in Western culture, we're much more based on the foreground as well. It gives you a very different perception of how you see reality. Sorry.
No. I keep thinking of the word selfish. That emptiness. For some, it's a pejorative in that we're viewed as being selfish if we're looking inward. If we're not constantly looking outward to do something different. Sorry, but that's the word that just keeps coming to mind.
Versus
why we can't move that forward.
Yeah.
And yet, as Brian points out, if we're not taking care of ourselves and looking at the uniqueness of each one of us, then in fact, we're not going to be able to help anyone on the outside, right?
Yeah.
I prefer self-full.
Sure, but when it's looked on as the pejorative, then it's that selfishness, perception of.
Yeah.
But I think on the converse side of that, there's kind of immense self-preoccupation. So being busy with the surface, you're immensely self-preoccupied. Ultimately, in the bigger sense, that is selfish, because you're not thinking about anything else and you're obsessed. And I think culture actually is reinforcing self-obsession.
Yep.
And I love what Brian said in terms of, what if our schools and our education was the greatest task of all was to discover the big self? Because like the mystics that realize this, they talk about the ocean and the depth of the ocean, and we're a drop. And what we're doing is it's all the flotsam that's drifting on the surface. That's what we're attracted by, and we're not really conditioned to dive deep. And in some way, that selflessness is also where you're most connected to everyone else. The more you know yourself, the more universal you become.
So rather than emptiness, Dave, does that mean we're potentially talking about the focus moving from the external to the internal? And what we're saying emptiness is just actually a movement?
For me, the external is critical.
Oh, the external is really critical right now.
I
love the divine play.
Let me just ask you a question about, so where do I end and everything else begins? So what's external and what's internal?
Well, you have a child, Barry. You have a child, right?
Speaking of external.
Yeah. So Barry, you have a child there that's very young, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so you watch what externally resonates to that child, and you and your wife will say, did he or she just do what we thought she just did? Did you see that? And the wife goes, wow, that was something else. And that's genetic resonance. That's the uniqueness sort of telling you that's an innate thing that child just did that was special. That's an external resonance to something that brings that out in the child.
So Andrew Webster is just asking about Theory U, and I'm fairly new to this, but I do know that Dave knows a thing or two about it. How is that relevant to this discussion, Dave?
Well, Theory U is a kind of mindfulness-based social and self-change model or method or process, and at the bottom of the U is this emptiness. If you go there, that's what they call source. And that's the place of ultimate creativity, ultimate letting go, and also the experience actually where all true novelty arises out of. So through practicing the process of theory U, they orientated towards social and entrepreneurial change, without going through the bottom and dissolving preconceptions and letting go, something new can't emerge. So that's a sort of simple overview of it.
And this letting go is something that, Brian, you talk about. Yeah, Barry seems to, Barry's commenting on as well. But that letting go is something that you talk about, Brian, don't you? In terms of the event that is the precursor, maybe, to an aha moment.
Yeah, there's letting go is part of the model. There's ask yourself, let go, aha, and do it, be it, and flow. That's the ontological framework. And they, ask yourself, let go. If you click on my profile, you see the waveform with the guy going like this. And then you see the Buddha, and then you see the light bulb, then you see a runner, you know. But the being, you see, I use the phrase doobie doobie do, music, Anne-Marie, to do be do. It's a vicious cycle. But the letting go is that moment, one aspect other than letting go of a certain kind of inner dialogue, or letting go of a partner that you realize is unhealthy for you, right? That addiction. There's the letting go before a moment of insight. And people that are masters have rituals around this. They can feel, they know that they can actually sense the pregnancy of an aha, an emergent insight, and they actually go take a shower, they take a walk. They actually know, and they can feel the evolution of their own thinking and their own emergent thought. So they know exactly when it's time to cook some bacon, not think, or whatever they do. So letting go is that nanosecond when you're in the shower and you go, you're not, no thought, right? Maybe that's the emptiness space. And you go, oh, that's what Chris meant when he told me I was this kind of guy, whatever. And so, yeah, letting go is something that most people that are very aware figure out how to make part of a ritual in their lives.
What
I think that's, sorry.
It's okay. What about the letting go of that little monster we have on our shoulder?
That inner dialogue.
Yeah. Self-critical all the time. Says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. Or this is not right for you. And all that kind of. Where does that letting go sort of fit into your scheme of things?
Well, you know, again, these are learned things, as we shared earlier, right? The cultural monster on your shoulder probably came from, you know, parents have an incredible effect, an incredible role modeling effect, right? Even before culture, by the age of 6, your kid is pretty molded based on not just your behavior. And this is the thing parents don't realize. It's not just your behavior. The brain of a child can pick up patterns of behavior that correlate to cognition.
Yeah.
So they're role modeling the way they're role modeling your inner dialogue. Yeah. Now, when I share this with parents, they go, oh, you know, poop. They don't realize the child's not just modeling, because we try to control that, right? As parents, we try to control what we say and do in front of the child. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Give them Melanie Klein to read. That'll sort them out.
So Jeremy's asking some questions about what practices do you make use of that support the states of emptiness, letting go. So Brian, we got the you know, having the shower and things like that, haven't we? And we've got the things like meditation. But I'm guessing there are other types of things that can break that attachment.
Well, everyone here, I guarantee, has, I mean, other than wine, everyone here has things they do to let go of thought and behaviors and to shut down the monster.
I go for a run.
Yeah.
It's being alone out on the road, I think, is the place where I wrote my master's and as well as my PhD papers. You're alone. And still have a purpose. You know, I think that's what I always liked about it. I could be out there getting the miles under my feet, and no one calling. Well, I got my master's and PhD in the old days. And the only reason I carry a phone now is to measure the miles. But that's what I do. I run.
And the thing is, it's rhythmic. And I think one of the forms of meditation always concerns its breathing, its focus. Focus, as Professor Preber once said to me. He said, there's only two types of meditation. It's either focus until you disappear, or expand. You have the same result.
I can count 16th notes when I'm out on my runs. Wow. as a tip of the hat to Anne Marie.
Yes. I think it has sometimes something to do with getting into a feeling state instead of a thinking state.
Yep.
In other words, you're using all your senses, and the brain tends to sort of go backwards, if you want, in another place. You just feel, you sense, which is why being in nature is so drastically important for me. I know it is. I lose all the rest, and I just feel and sense what is around me and what comes forward.
Yeah.
Vibrations.
For me, 2 or 3 things that have had a strong theme in my own practice have been around intention. So having an intention towards freedom that I've sustained and committed to. Also curiosity, just having interest and curiosity about experience and noticing. So when those combine, you can notice what your thoughts are doing, and then you have that space where you can choose them or not. But it takes practice and time, and sitting still as well, or whatever equivalent that brings you to stillness, like Lewis was describing.
So in an organizational context, this is sometimes harder to practice because my experience is people they want to do things, they don't want to not do things. So I think this is part of the challenge, is that individually people may talk about mindfulness, but often in an organizational context, it's always about doing something rather than not doing something. It's about adding something sometimes rather than taking something away.
Do you remember the HP ads where they did just what you're talking about? They actually exemplified not doing. They had someone behind a desk with his feet up on the desk, just letting go. and it was about creativity. It was about asking yourself. They were selling the value of that. But of course, no one bought into that. And then Calvin Klein came out with Being It about 3 years later. So our advertising tends to show the edge of consciousness, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because we're not at that edge yet.
I think also emptiness doesn't preclude action.
No, it actually directs it.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's not about not doing. It's just about noticing what you are doing and where it's coming from. So when an action comes from emptiness, it's usually responding to what is actually needed, rather than what the want is, rather than the desire. So that's usually where we try and fill the space up. So like the executives I work with, they're as busy as they were when they first came to me, but they're nowhere near as tired. They're nowhere near as exhausted because they really aren't doing that much, and then they decide that they don't really need the meetings that much anymore anyway. So the focus becomes different because, in a way, they're fully attentive to actually what is going on, so they can listen to the person in front of them, and that's actually quite easeful. Yeah, Lafredo.
Yeah. I think you just said it. And that's the link. And what you just said is the link between the emptiness and the doing, and that's the listening. Once you've gotten to that place of being empty, if you will, you're more receptive, I think, particularly with what Anne-Marie said a little while ago about being out in nature. And I think that's why I go out for the run, to get away and be at that empty stage, and then be far more receptive to ideas coming in, even if they're my own ideas, recycling or doing something different. But in Chris's idea of being within the organizational setting, if you're empty, now you've got the opportunity to listen. And maybe that's where, and that's why what you're saying is that your executives are less tired, is because they're not trying to do it all on their own.
Exactly. Yeah. Who wants to do it on their own?
Yeah,
who wants to do it on their own? It's
Right.
a bane of modern society that we should think that we ought to do it alone. I mean, we're not set up to do it. We're not set up as human beings to do that. Our nervous system doesn't work like that at all.
No, absolutely not. And that's why, the confounding part is that the emptiness is still viewed as being selfish. And until that's reversed, now, your executives are going to be constantly agitated. And, how do you get over that hump where that's the culture? And so that probably goes to, I'm pointing in the wrong direction here. And that's what Chris is talking about from an organizational perspective.
Yes, agreed. Yeah. And that's what's so exciting about that sort of approach, the guild approach, is that it brings it down on that level and then shoves it back up.
Right.
Sends it up.
Okay.
Yeah. So some of the things I've been doing, guilds. I mean, it reminds me actually, Caroline, a conversation we've had about the fact that we're taking things away. We're deconstructing people's preconceived ideas about how a time or a space is going to be used, and then it creates opportunities sometimes for people.
Absolutely, and that's the pivot for transformation, isn't it? So the reality is that when we start to remove what's not necessary, then we become more in the present and more able to transform. And I think the reason I set up 47% was because a couple of scientists have proved that we are not focused on the task 47% of our time. And so within an organizational structure, what did that mean? What are we thinking about? And does that mind wandering actually make us happy? And so whilst we talk about focusing more on ourselves, our lack of understanding around what our self is and what it's designed to be means that we can spend even more time listening to our inner dialogue and telling ourselves stories that don't serve us, that need to be taken away and to be worked on. So it's it's an interesting dichotomy of a journey for people to go on, where actually selfish is not the state that we're looking for, but actually an awareness of self is what we're looking for. And how we spend that time within organization is where you create the space in which emptiness comes. And I think some of the things that we've talked about on the show so far, I feel very much that I'm an energy. And so where does that energy get placed when we are trying to find our silence and our stillness? What do we do with that energy, and how does that connect to what we're talking about? And I guess the other question that I have is, and it's kind of lost me, but as we move much more into collaborative cultures and sharing economies and knowledge economies, then what we're not looking for necessarily is silence and pure listening. Because when I listen, for example, it takes an awful lot to remove a lot of the inner dialogue that I'm having whilst I'm listening to people talk. And my contribution can get lost if I sit in that space of battle for too long. And so how do we trick ourselves into understanding how to pace our emptiness?
Love.
Carolyn, I have three voices, and the one that you're referring to is, was much louder when I was younger, the battle of judgment while others speak. And then I had another voice come up, and it just, it beat that one up. It said, "Stop talking, you're killing myself." So I fully appreciate you bringing that out. That's a beautiful thing. People don't. Listening is like, there's practitioners in the world in the last, 15 years, in terms of a greater movement that have focused strictly on teaching people how to listen and feel the vibrations. Anne Marie, the vibrations. I heard that, by the way.
Yeah, they are. It's very much,
Yes.
what talk about very often, the vibration, how you get to actually feel them. But again, it's going back to our senses. It's extraordinary how that works. And in one of the lessons that I give, I ask people to actually completely use their senses when they're actually approach a piece of music or a piece of art or anything creative. And it's all about touch, and it's about smells. It's about everything that you can use, which is not so much the intellect. But a few words came to mind when Caroline was speaking, and I thought that was really, really interesting, Caroline. How do we equate emptiness with openness and humility? And how does, I've got a motto, which is, I'll do very quickly, is in the stillness we seek, there's an inevitable motion. And I think stillness is not stillness as we define it. There is so much motion in the stillness that we actually are looking for. And that's what we'll try and tame, if you want, somehow.
You know, it comes back to vibration as well. I mean, frequency and vibration. Dave, I know that you know Boehm's work. Amma, I don't know if you know David Boehm's work. So I was how blessed can you get to be around two holographic theory guys that meet serendipitously? One's working on quantum reality, that's David Boehm. The other one's working on quantum brain, and they don't know they exist. And someone connects the two of them, and it turns out they're using the same mathematics. Now, Carl's work, Anne Marie, was about discovering that all the senses have basically process information in frequency.
Yeah.
And we have this digital world, right? Everything's digital. Well, that's very primitive. That's an axon and a synapse firing and a 0 and a 1. Oh my God. But it's done a lot for us, right? But it's taken us off this path of the analog world, the vibrational world. Yeah. And that's actually how the dendrites around the axon, we forgot about those, but that's where we're going next. We're going to go into this world of thinking in terms of no space and time, thinking in terms of vibration, and the science and the technology is probably going to lead us there, especially the technology. We're going to end up, this conversation here could happen 20 years from now, and the kids will go, oh yeah, they were talking about that then? Huh? You know.
I think Valerie makes a really interesting point in the comments. She talks about whether or not the environments really impact on our ability for emptiness. And I think one of the things you mentioned, Brian, was around age. And actually, you know, is it just a developmental task that actually as we are born, we commence learning? As we are of a certain age, you mentioned when you were younger, it's about judgment, assessment, evaluation, having that opinion, having that road to follow. And then as your requirements of life or your environment changes as you get older, maybe more financially secure, more settled, does some of that noise remove itself and you become more content, and therefore you can find greater space for your inner self and your meditation. And so is this a developmental journey that we're all on, or is it something that we are trying to direct youngsters to go on? Do we want young people? I certainly know, working in organizations with the movement towards digital, where young people don't have to contribute verbally so much. All of the information is constantly there. It's constantly available to them. They're not used to picking up the phone and communicating verbally. They're used to sending a text message or a email or a note in a meeting. And so therefore they become quieter. And within that quiet space, within an organizational context, as Chris is talking about, we're paying them for their information. We're paying them for their viewpoint. We're paying them for their judgment. We're paying them for their clarity and their ability to lead and their ability to shape and form. And so what we want is that kind of focused aliveness. I operate much more to myself when I am focused. I don't operate as well to myself when I'm not focused. But focus means that I have to be doing a task. I have to be thinking about something. I have to be stimulated. And so how much of this is development, how much of it is environment, and how much of it is purely down to your situation in terms of whether we're seeking that silence or not?
You know, when you think of a prodigy, if you think of a prodigy is an aberration, right? A prodigious child is an aberration. So they're not affected by a lot of things. I mean, everything's cleaved off of them already because it's so obvious what their gifts are. And most of us aren't that way. Most of us have a matrix of dispositions we're trying to fit together to find out, well, what am I supposed to do? You know, so the prodigy extends the example of the neurobiology that can lead the environment. You know, think of a teenager. I mean, I've raised teens. Okay, what's the greatest? Yeah, what's the greatest revolt that they have? It's like they're in high school and they want to be part of everybody. They don't want to be different, but they want to be unique. They don't want to stand out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's incredible. Yeah. But they don't know. There's no curriculum again, and most parents don't have a curriculum for, well, what makes me not so. I don't use the word special, by the way, because I think special has a really weird, massive connotations. But I use unique because it allows you to have. Unique relates to purpose, right? And unique relates to complementarity, right? Right now, there is a certain degree of complementarity in this space between us, right? That we don't even know exists. But we'd have to get to know each other a little better to discover that. But the complementarity is the power. That's the synergy. That's where you get overtones. You get a sound in a choir that doesn't exist in any one voice. It just emerges. Anyway.
And you need a certain amount of emptiness to create that shared voice, you know, or else you end up with a band with like 8 lead guitarists in. So that's the interesting thing, isn't it, about receptivity in a group context, is that interactions become more inherently musical because there are gaps, because it's the gaps that define the music. If there weren't any gaps, it would just be a cacophony, or you know, like as Lemmy used to say about Motorhead, everything louder than everything else. You know, it becomes like a competitive thing. And you know, I think that's interesting, and I see that a lot with my work in organizations where in different group contexts there can be certain assumptions made about who gets the airtime, which is really, really interesting. So, and I think there seems to be 2 or 3 different dynamics that are work. One of them can be to do with the emptiness. In other words, who has the right over the emptiness? You know, if there's silence, who does that silence belong to?
That'd be me.
Yeah.
Me.
T-shirt.
So me.
Exactly. So one angle on that is, you know, Dave is the most senior, so it's Dave's. Dave goes first, and then it's Amma, and then it's Brian. So there's one angle there. Another angle is it can be to do with who's already spoken. Is it that it's easier for them to speak if they've already spoken first? So it belongs to the people that have already taken some, rather than the people who haven't had any yet. And this is, you know, because there's a jeopardy. This is a really good reason for everybody on a conference call to, you know, sometimes introduce themselves at the start, because there isn't that added jeopardy, or I haven't spoken, therefore I'm going to continue not to speak. There's also some people find silence deafening and physically uncomfortable. And in fact, you know, in the stuff that I do, with guilds and stuff, we often have awkward silences, and the reason is because I don't want anybody really to dominate it, because I want it to be like a shared space, like it's a band, like we're playing together, and it's basically, some people, you know, don't like that. Some people are cool with it, and or it may be that they don't like it initially because they don't know what it can turn into. And I think I've made a point before that often the awkward silences in the short term lead to better conviviality of conversation over the longer term.
Well, I know that Barry, for example, hates silence.
Well, it can be
Yeah, Barry, you can tell how much.
Yeah. Hate silence.
Yeah.
So
it can be a very, very fierce weapon as well. It can be very
Yes.
controlled.
That's
Silence.
kind of that's
yeah,
exactly right.
yeah, absolutely. Just to your point, Anne-Marie, I've got a real fear of silence. So I have a physical stress response to silent treatment. So if somebody ghosts me, stonewalls me, goes silent on me, they can beat me, argue with me, shout at me, and I'll be absolutely fine because I know what I'm working with. But what I can't deal with is the new realities that get created in silence. And it doesn't sit well with me. It creates an anxiety. And that comes from childhood. And I think one of the things that Valerie's saying in the notes is, she's saying, to my point earlier, I think, that maybe the journey isn't so much about becoming anything, but maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you. And I think we get that freedom of space, don't we, as we get older and we get more secure in our environments, to really reflect on who we are and what we've learnt about ourselves. But one of the joys of life for me is learning something new about myself all of the time. I like the fact that when I'm put under different experiences, I'm constantly evolving, I'm constantly learning something new, and I love the activity and the energy of that. I love the activity and the energy of dialogue and debate. So whereas you guys would probably all sit there quite happily and quiet, I love the fact that if I create a little bit of conflict or challenge or energy, that I get some energy back. So with John, Brian, head in hands, oh my God, here she goes. But the reality is it's really, really important.
But that's one approach to dissonance. Create dissonance and see what happens.
Yeah, well, it is kind of, again, you know, from a musical point of view, we need the consonance and dissonance. It can't be just all consonant. It gets a bit dull, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's going back to that state of, well, I think it is going back to that state of innocence, the child, sort of to be receiving what comes from outside and to be curious and excited about it. And I think if we can retain that, we have a lot to gain.
So no, go ahead. Go.
I was just going to say, so my experience of living in the monastery, you know, like, was that people came at all sorts of different ages. So, and with all sorts of different requirements, and they didn't necessarily even come with, like sometimes, you know, being a monk seems to be like, you know, like you're already enlightened before you go, but actually most of us go because there's intense suffering. You're actually a complete and utter wreck when you go there. It's the end of the stream. I mean, you know, I remember once I was sitting in sort of the main area of the monastery, and I watched a guy come in with shaved head, braces, like a skinhead, walk through the door, and something said to me, this guy is going to become a monk, you know, and I know he's still a monk now. Yeah, he was a security guard in Czechoslovakia, and he studied Buddhism in the evening as a security guard. But there was something about him and the way that he came in, and he was young, you know, very, very young at that.
His vibration.
Yeah, I was a really child, so I was very spiritual as a child, and and that was self-led. So that wasn't something that was enforced on me from parents.
Exactly.
And as I grew up, I used to fast, and I'd find all of my answers from the universe through fasting and spending days in prayer, if you like, albeit I would be actively in prayer and fasting, actually was my emptiness. That was my empty place. And within that, I was healthier, happier, sharper, more fulfilled, more full up, if you like, as opposed to empty. And if we talk about emptiness being that fullness, then 100% you can get it from your spirituality or your resonance or taking away your need to consume. And I think one of the things Brian talked about earlier was, does digital create this new universe for us? Or is it, in my opinion, taking our universe away? Is it creating too much noise in our environments, I've never been, so I'm addicted to technology. My iPhone 6 is my cocaine. It's my drug that I managed to avoid It's not even an iPhone 6. I've got no idea why I said that. It's an iPhone 11, and I say that because I need the status. Okay.
I feel better
My
already.
consumerist status is not going to allow that to air.
It's important that you said that.
I love your emptiness, Caroline. I love your emptiness.
But it's distracting me all the time. It's giving me news. It's telling me about terrorist events around the world. It's creating moods for me. One minute I'm seeing something awful happen in the news and I might feel a bit sad about that, and the next minute I'm receiving a text from a loved one and I'm all fired up and excited about it. But the reality is that that technology defines my state. And so I guess, Emma, when you moved into becoming a monk and you've removed that technology and you've removed
we didn't know that. I was a geek in the monastery, you see. I mean, like, I looked after and designed the audio systems, and everything was on MP3, and we had databases and computers in lots of rooms. Admittedly, we did have 3 months of silence every year, and it was a forest monastery, so we did live in the forest. But the idea that we removed things, wasn't it? Actually, I had a very busy life, and I had a lot of stress there. I had my worst arguments in my life in the monastery. I never had worse arguments anywhere than living in the monastery. They go together. Yeah, seriously, I can tell you about arguments about religion, where religious things were put, and some of these things are public even. So I'm not saying anything out of the box, but we had to learn how to work with these things, so I worked with young people. I ran family camps, and I brought, kids came to the monastery. I ran teenage retreats. I traveled all over England, going to FE colleges, trying to run dialogue with young people around this, so, but I get, I do get that society keeps pulling us out. I get that, and being in the monastery did give me some protection away from that, because I didn't have to worry about money. I didn't have to worry about food. I was a beggar. Either you got it or you didn't. I took my begging bowl out. It either went in or it didn't. That's how it was. And that gives you a certain attitude towards life, which is quite, it's quite freeing. But on the other side of it, is that there was lots of people and, lots of different dynamics. I lived in a multicultural community with so many different people and different ages. One of the nuns' husband was deputy prime minister of Cambodia at one point. She escaped via a helicopter, and I never saw her husband again. Then we had the security guard that came from Prague. Such diverse people. So it was a very interesting experience.
Oh.
Yeah. Barry, you ought to say something. You've not said anything. Come on.
I don't want Barry to open his mouth.
Okay, all right.
I think he just needs to stay there and be empty for all of us. Barry, this is the longest.
Dave, you're on silence.
This is the longest Barry pause I've ever experienced from Barry.
I thought Barry's modeling the awkward silence for everybody.
Doesn't bother me. I hug, by the way, Barry, I hug you all the time. I'm not sure you feel it, but I do hug you from a distance.
I know, I do feel it. I found the title of the conversation, like radical emptiness, really both challenging and inspiring, just to be with, to sit with, and I'm a bit lost, actually, not generally, but in this conversation, and just trying to be with it, be with you. I did write something quite short in response to emptiness, which I can read if you want. It's only a couple of minutes.
Yep.
Where did I arrive from? If not here, then where? This gift of thought so precious, and also causing me to stare. How can this be real, I ask myself, looking deep into the abyss. Am I truly dense, held together by matter? Something seems amiss. Or am I light, spaciousness, consciousness, love, remembering itself into being, from below and above. A sound escapes me, released into the dark. I close my eyes, waiting for its return, of my own unique rainbow arc.
Oh.
Oh.
In every color, every shape, every exquisite form, in this moment, right here, right now, as you are my witness, I'm again reborn.
Oh,
Yay!
very beautiful, Barry.
Well, how do we follow that?
Barry,
So-
I just experienced a Barry pause after that.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, that was brilliant. I wouldn't mind just returning to matters slightly more organizational and less otherwise, but there's a kind of a link there. I mean, one thing is interesting, Emma, you were talking about your experience in the monastery where you had your needs met, which potentially, while in certain respects, was that a freeing, you talked about that being like a liberating experience. And this reminds me a little bit of, Bertrand Russell's got this paper or this book in praise of idleness. And, again, it reminds me of, people like Leo Tolstoy is like independently wealthy. Therefore, he didn't have to worry about that type of thing. Therefore, he was able to devote himself to his literature. And it's the same with, I think, a number of notable scientists. Is it Maxwell or a lot of these early pioneers were they were independently wealthy. Even Shelley, I think, came from quite a wealthy background, didn't he? So I'm guessing that freeing ourselves, actually emptying ourselves from an obligation or a worry or a concern, then like frees our mind. I mean, maybe this is where children get their liberation from. It's innate, of course, but maybe they don't have these worries and concerns about providing and all that sort of thing that we do as adults.
Well, they don't have a prefrontal cortex. They're in the process of developing that, which makes a huge difference because you're not thinking cognitively. So that's an important thing with children. But also in the monastery, when you remove all the basic needs, like Maslow's hierarchy, you end up with yourself. And then that becomes where, then you start to see the jealousies, like we'd all get jealous about the type of shoes that we had or the socks that we had because there was nothing else to do. You see, the mind couldn't focus on any of the external things anymore, so it just became more and more refined. But the same thought was the same thought that creates a war.
Yeah,
it's
that's
no different.
interesting.
It's no different. It's no. It's just amplified at a vast greater scale. So, so it was nice to have all the basic needs met, but there are plenty of people also that have done it without all of that and done it through intense suffering and terrible lives. And I've read about gangsters and all sorts of people that have woken up out of their suffering without any of that, without having any of their needs met. Somehow they've also done it. So it's an expedient means. It's the monastery can be, but it can also limit you. It can restrict you. It can pull you back.
I think think of disability when people are. Speaking of needs not being met, let's say you lose a leg or two. I mean, the amazing things when restriction can bring out the self in ways that we never experienced otherwise. I mean, we've had when people lose what looks like a basic need, 2 legs. That's a basic need.
I was disabled for 4 years, so I know what it's like to be disabled. I know what it's like to be told that you're never going to walk again and that you've got years of therapy that are not going to get you through. And I know what that feels like. I've had the disabled catalogues come through the door and being looked after and cared for. And I can tell you I've also been fairly successful, and there's been no difference in my level of happiness as a disabled person to somebody who has been really successful with a big bank balance coming through and lots of work creativity going on. I think you find that whatever inner peace you can in whatever situation you're in. But I think the challenge is if we are slightly hardwired for conflict. You know, I mean, back to the monastery and kind of finding things to fight about. If you look at, you know, sounds like an episode of Made in Chelsea, where you've got so much money that all you can think about is your relationships and your boyfriends and who's after who. It's all fairly shallow stuff, isn't it? And so, you know, when we talk about letting go, we're almost letting go of our ego, aren't we? We're almost letting go of ourselves entirely and adopting something new. And when you look at transformation in an organization, as consultant that's gone in to help with transformations, I've never been asked to come in and help at a point when the transformation is just being born or the old system is just being let go of. They call a transformation consultant in midway through the noise and then go fix it. And so the reality is that actually, you know, if we see transformation about death, then I don't think organizations have understood that yet well enough. And if we talk about transformation as a person being about letting go ego, then I don't think we've understood that well enough either. And if you look for that peace in the monastery, you're clearly not going to find it if you've not left behind your ego.
No, but that's the point of the monastic regime, is actually to point you to that place as fast as possible, and it does that at very high speed. But the thing is, most of us are not ready for that.
Yeah, I like to differentiate ego between light and dark, gang. I think everyone needs a self, and the self for me, as it evolves coherence, becomes a clear, coherent, beautiful ego. The dark ego, the symbolically attached, the thing that's distracted, the thing that, you know. Again, by the way, Carolyn, you rose up. Whatever happened to you during disability, you made a choice. You could have gone either way when you were down.
Thank you.
You made a choice. So something inside of you had a purpose to continue to evolve.
Yeah, but I'm not running marathons, Brian. I should be running marathons. I should be like, yes, I did it. I can walk, and now I'm like running marathons. Sadly not. Sitting on my ass, chatting over podcasts about emptiness.
Quite a waste of
time. This thread resonates for me around, because of the notion Chris brought in around being in the world but not of it. So you could say a kind of an attainment might be that you, like Brian was saying, you perfect the vehicle, but you're deeply rooted in this silence or emptiness. So in a way, you can engage more fully and be more fully alive through embracing emptiness than you can if you're just acting out of the impulses and desires and needs of ego in the way that Brian's described it. But I think part of the journey is perfecting and developing the vehicle to become a deeper and a more coherent expression of what this true self or emptiness really is.
I quite like that, Dave. I think it's also that emptiness, if we take it further and just picking up on what Caroline said, I suppose the ultimate emptiness is death. And that's the annihilation of self, whether it's to do with that in an absolute sense or even metaphorically. You know, if I'm changing job roles or I lose my job, it's a type of death every time I fall asleep and wake up the next morning. In a small way, it's something that's akin to that. And I find that's very interesting to relate that to what you were saying, Amma, about everybody's like, envious about each other's flip-flops or whatever it might be at the monastery, because I find that what we, in an organizational context, those pathologies around identity come out big time, particularly say around, where I work, which is in technology. We have a big disruptive technology comes in and everybody's trying to treat it as if it hasn't happened. Or not everybody necessarily, but the first reaction is typically denial. So it's as if, we're giving people ray guns and they're hitting each other over the head. They're tying them to sticks and hitting each other over the head with. That's the kind of, this is like a very common occurrence with technology. And I'm trying to work out why that is. And the way I've come up with to understanding it is really based on Simon Wardley's work around value chains, and it's really I don't fully understand value chains, but as I understand it, whereas a supply chain is the steps involved in taking goods and getting them to the customer, a value chain is whereas a wider industry, my niches in terms of adding value to this wider ecosystem. And then what happens is, though Simon Wardley's model is around Genesis, custom built, product, commodity. When something gets to commodity, it creates this explosion of innovation, like Gutenberg's printing press in, was it 16 something, and the problem with that is when things get to that stage, it creates massive death, because what we're doing is we're saying, all the people who were copying out vellum manuscripts in room, it's like the death now has been sounded, but people will want to kind of keep on to that because that's their identity. So
gives them purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Gives them purpose. So how do I, and I'm addicted to some extent, I could say, rather like being addicted to my iPhone, I'm addicted to my identity in a way.
Yeah.
And part of letting go and emptiness is to say, I am not my identity, or I'm not my profession.
Yeah.
And that's pretty tough when it's being I've had days of it being reinforced,
Well, there's also a question of what do you need to replace it with? Sorry, someone else.
Yes, I was thinking in terms of what is the practicalities of transformation and the practicalities of change. And I think unless we actually go one step at a time, the difficult thing is to see change as huge and a whole transformation. And I think it's setting realistic goals one at a time towards the final transformation that we want to actually get into. But if we don't set those small goals one at a time, I think it's very difficult to actually go through it. It's almost too much. There's a fear then that we're going to lose too much.
It's why the change cycle is based on the grief. The change curve is based on grief. Is basically because people are losing something, and as we all lose something, whatever that is, we go through grief, and therefore every organisation has to switch on to the fact that they have to move forward and move people through those milestones. And the problem with transformation is that organisations don't often think about people. In fact, particularly in system transformation, I've heard numerous system consultants saying, but the machine will change the people. It will drive different behaviours. And what they forget is about the people's emotional connection to what they were already doing, and people's ability to break the machine and to navigate it and to do something other than conform with what that machine is designed to do. So to your answer, Chris, that's the reality for me in managing any system transformation, is that the people will circumnavigate it if they've been forgotten within that process.
Yeah, you know what, guys, it's amazing to me that you're asking an organization to do exactly what their memory as a organization doesn't want people to do in terms of evolve. The last thing they want is for a guy to discover that their identity is not their identity, or their evolving identity. Because they're, it's, as Carolyn's mentioned in 3 other podcasts, it's a command and control system. It thinks it's most efficient and it thinks it's most profitable when it can manage behavior, but it doesn't want people to truly be unique. Because then the system, the hierarchy would just, the dysfunctional patriarchal stuff that we all know about, it's going to fail. And, so, we're asking organizations to do exactly what they are designed not to do for people.
And not just organisations, entire countries. If you look at
sure, it's all systems.
Yeah.
So I think these non-living models that we have running our organisations, they actually kill life, and they suffocate and they restrict life. So therefore, there's a kind of overemphasis and addiction to stability and predictability. The humans are living systems and they're changing all the time.
Yeah.
But our attention is focused on the fixed, on the identity, on the name. So actually, we're fixated in fixed and naming and actually, should we be trained more as ourselves as living systems, then the ability to adapt to change will come more naturally. But we're from birth, we're categorized, pigeonholed, programmed, given knowledge and information, all of which sets up this addiction to rigid structures.
You know, Barry and his wife are looking at this newborn child right now, and he's considering the world and this beautiful new life. Barry, how do you look at the world bringing a new life into it right now? How do you nurture that blossoming?
Well, the most important seeing for me is that thoughts aren't real. They're just thoughts. And the other knowing is, I don't know who I am, but I know I'm not my thoughts. So it's to be suspicious of all thinking. And for me, that's just a higher context. And the question I'm curious about most, and the one that I really sit in within this conversation is like, who am I? Who are we when we're not thinking? Because I'm still here.
Are we able to feel? Is thinking feeling, Barry?
Well, I feel it's more fundamental than that. I mean, the gap between my daughter's sensing, expression, action is zero, because she's just a living expression of who she is. She's pre-cognitive. She's acting out of her beingness. It's just the most beautiful, exquisite, imaginable, possible. And I feel, and I know that's a human possibility. Like Dave was saying, we're living entities within a living environment. And it's the mechanization of our humanness that suppresses us and causes the challenge and the issues. And it's completely human to want to get out of that and to resist that and to move away from it. And it's why we adore children. I don't have words to describe what it's like to feel and be with my daughter. It's beyond anything. And I certainly feel and care a lot about the possibility of the world that she ends up living in, working in, socializing in. And I feel we're all at whatever point we're at around what we see. None of us is either right or wrong. And the sharing of that seeing is invaluable, because it's only from others sharing their seeing with me that I was able to see new and different possibilities. It's an old cliche now, but we're like fish born into water that don't know we're wet. The thinking is introduced, the cognition is introduced at such an early stage that the suppression of our real self is enormous. The miracle is that we find a way to the self, to the surface, and emerge as who we are. That possibility, that uniqueness of expression is the most beautiful thing in this world.
And that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because what we do with children is we try to program them almost immediately, don't we, in terms of, against the phases and what they should eat and how they should eat it and where they should eat it and what the time they should rest, and the books that we read them and the songs that we sing them and the endless narrative that we give them is all about that programming. It's the coding of the system, isn't it? It sounds harsh coming from a woman. You know what I mean?
No, but I find it hilarious. The highest context for education is not learning, it's compliant. And then you ask yourself the question, compliant to what? Because what is the world we are living in that we are wanting children to align to? Well, we've got it upside down.
We need reactive.
Align our world with the innocent expression that's in our children. I have nothing to teach.
And that's why they're creative. they find their creativity by not being compliant, don't they? We find our creativity.
That's
Artists find their creativity by not being compliant. It's part of who they are. Musicians do it. It's the fact that we assume that good is suited and booted and counting numbers and time and motion studies and all the rest of it, whereas actually that's where all the restriction happens and the compliance happens, and that's where you lose innovation and creativity and value.
Dave, speaking of curiosity,
that's why this lockdown is the biggest opportunity for humanity there's ever been.
Absolutely. But what do you do with the time? I mean, some people are smart enough to realize, gee, this is periodic. This is going to happen again. So what do I need to figure out so that I'm not at this kind of loss for my job, my career, my happiness, my comfort? And for me, this is the greatest self-reflective choice can be made now as never before. And but how do we get people to develop that look in the mirror? How do we get them to look in the mirror at this time?
And also, there's a lot of people there's a lot of people suffering as well, and we just, I think also have to be careful around that there's a lot of people that just haven't got the money, haven't got the time, haven't got the space. And I know, yes, they can do it but they can't. And how do we also support them in creating those structures? I'm a big one personally, just on a personality level, for basic income, just so that you give actually people that space. That they could, there might be a possibility of using this using it in a different way. And the other point, well, there's a couple of other things I wanted to say. One was about the development, which is that we do go through as far as I understand it, we go through a developmental process, and that developmental process allows us to recognize emptiness. Without it, we wouldn't be able to recognize it. So the self, developing an ego, actually allows you to, in the end, put it down, right? And that's the death process. And my name, that's why I kept my Buddhist. This is my Buddhist name. I'm Renato. It's my name I was given as a monk one day before I ordained by the abbot. And the Mara means death, and A means absence, and Nato means refuge. So my name means refuge in what doesn't die. That's the place. So I have it as a sort of constant thing when everybody else calls me Renato, that what to remember.
Well, doesn't that speak to your point? Refuge in what doesn't die.
Yes.
That sometimes the greatest struggles are the place of birth.
Yes.
Yeah. And actually, is there something here around identity then and fixation? Dave used the word fixation. So in a transformational context, if I'm fixated on something that's not really me, but I think it's me, then I'm more vulnerable to something that looks like it can die. The thing that's more universal is a deeper self, but that needs to be outside of these fixations. And just to make a trite point about organizations, that seems to indicate that we need in the future, talking to you and your young daughter, Barry, the future is going to be about greater levels of flexibility. So therefore lesser levels of fixation. And then to some extent that sounds like that, as well as being traumatic, there's an upside to that. Maybe it makes us easier to wrestle with these little identity puzzles of, is this me or is this just my job?
You might frame this kind of COVID pause, or what you just described, Chris, as a kind of developmental opportunity for humankind.
Oh, nice.
Because without being able to raise our game and respond to uncertainty from this place of the soul or the self or whatever you call it, we just won't have the resources because of the multiplying complexity, the kind of diminishing of structure, and our institutions aren't working or are starting to fade out in the face of these complex challenges. So you could say it's time for the human race to get healthier, based on the radical emptiness.
It is very much
That's really easy to say, isn't it? Unless you are already in a state of poverty. So if you're already in a state of poverty, actually your mind may be able to, if it's lucky, get to a state of peace with that. But your reality, your futures, your ability to feed, your ability to stay warm, the basic hierarchy of needs, if they're ripped away from you, then where do you find your peace? And actually, whilst we're asking everybody to find this state of emptiness, for many people, that emptiness can contain real anxiety. And so we keep ourselves busy to keep ourselves away from the anxious state of actually inner reflection and where am I and how did I get to this age and end up in this mess, and why did I give my 40 years of my experience to that company that just let me go because COVID's happened, but they've still got their profits? You know, there's all of these questions that within this emptiness that we talk about, that dialogue has to be tamed and controlled and worked through. And, you know, we're looking at people, it's, you know, that if you're in a good state of mind, if you're wealthy, if you are settled, if you are of a certain age, but if you're young, and we're seeing 1 suicide a month in students at the moment, if you're young and you're feeling hopeless about your future or your lack of control over your system mechanisms like voting, for example, or feeling that your future that you're going to adopt has just been spent by governments, you know, if you're not feeling like you're part of a global entity because the whole of the UK decided to Brexit, if you're feeling like whatever you're feeling like, or if you've got a mental health condition that's prohibiting you from having rational thought, this space of emptiness can feel like a death for people. It can feel an incredibly anxious space.
So what's the solution, Caroline? I mean, we all understand the problems.
Well, it's about it's firstly about not judging people that don't want to be in the empty space, I guess. I think it's secondly about nourishment, isn't it? And self-nourishment and collective nourishment. I think it's about us holding the hands of the universe and really allowing the wisdom and the answers to come through us rather than of us. And I think it's about having this non-inward looking but absolute outward looking, which we have seen as part of the pandemic. We've seen much more outward looking than we've seen inward looking.
I disagree. I lived in the mountains in a community, and I've never seen more love appear.
That's what I'm saying. As part of this pandemic, we're much more outward looking. We're much more looking after each other, and we're much more.
But in the process, people are self-reflecting on the love they're experiencing. So there's a reciprocating thing going on.
Yeah,
it's nourishment.
Yeah. Have you seen Nextdoor? Anyone here participate in a thing called Nextdoor.com?
Yeah.
Okay, it's an incredible space. When COVID hit, the transformation of the dialogue there was incredible for where I was at.
Well, it's something that Schumacher was talking about, as if people mattered. And suddenly we realized, people really matter.
Thank you.
People really matters, health matters, you know, community matters.
But the community organizations which have developed through COVID will get stronger. In my opinion, will get stronger and stronger. They are there to stay. They're not going away.
I find I don't find it so helpful myself to sort of theorize about who's suffering and what they might be suffering. It's more, well, what can I do within my own sphere of influence, and how can I act and make the world a more compassionate place? Because there's endless suffering in the world, and in fact, worrying about it can be also a barrier or an encumbrance to actually acting and doing something about it.
Yeah.
So. And of course, I spent my 30 years of my career trying to relieve the suffering of excluded young people. So I know exactly what they're going through. But I do feel these circumstances can be consciously, because everything's in flux, consciously shaped to shape a more empathic compassionate civilization. If we, just through acting in that way and advocating for it and leading in that way. And I think that because it's all in flux, there's possibility, there's greater possibility now than there's ever been, and that's not to deny
Yes.
suffering, pain, anxiety. It's not to deny it, but actually we could all be better for it, and our civilization could be better if those of us that
chaos
are in the lead in that way.
So
Chaos
does
is
that
always
come
the
back to
moment of
what?
transformation.
Yeah. So does that come back to what Barry was? Because Barry jumped on the lockdown just as I was having the same thought before. And so, Dave, does that acknowledgement of the suffering, combined with everyone who is that empathic talent, if you will, then start to put pressure up onto the organizational transformation that Chris was talking about earlier, so that you've got this whirlpool going of people who care, people who want to acknowledge the suffering that Ara is talking about earlier, that there is suffering. There are people who cannot make the changes that many of the rest of us can. And so going back to Barry's thought that really clicked with me, during the lockdown, we are all making changes. And so within that organizational structure, is that all just starting to bubble up, and those who can't are slipstreaming behind us?
Well, we've said it before on the call, I like to think of an alternative system of influence. So we don't have to change the structure, but if the system of influence is more powerful in these fluctuating conditions, it will attract the right kind of energy to it, and the right resources, and the right opportunity.
It was Brian that really helped me. Sorry, Dave.
No, go ahead. You carry on, Barry. Carry on, Barry.
It was Brian that really helped me see this beginning of lockdown. Because I've worked in organizational change for 25 years, 130 organizations across the world in all contexts. And I came to see the nature of coercion is fundamentally wrong in all of its manifestations, subtle to overt. And I was stuck with just that seeing. And it was Brian that gave me the language of expansion through resonance. It's our resonant frequency as humans and our innate capacity to relate that creates this lightness, this possibility, this space, this breath, these opportunities. And it's resonance that's, for me, the new language of organizations, of transformation, all of the mechanized, Six Sigma and, God knows what, let's hammer it with another process. We all know they don't really serve any function other than to perpetuate the mind's little puppet show. The humanistic revolution happening right now, and it's going to happen whether we want it to happen or not. It's out of our hands. The opportunity is to. I love what Caroline said about the fear of the unknown. That fear has been shed, significant in me, and to some extent still is. And that encouragement to look and to look together is how we walk together forward into the new reality that's emerging. And it takes a lot. It takes heart, it takes courage, it takes compassion. Like, what else are we going to do? Watch Netflix and drink Sauvignon.
It takes letting go as well, doesn't it, Barry? It takes letting go of all of those systems that we know don't work. It takes letting go of everything that we thought we knew about our organizations, ourselves, our communities, letting go all of that and rethinking and reimagining what it could be and what the future will look like, so that it serves everybody instead of just ourselves. And it comes back to that kind of collaborative consumerism rather than hyper consumerism, and collaborative working rather than hyper focused on what's in it for me and where does that fit with me in my hierarchy.
But that's why education is so drastically important, because to reintroduce or introduce creativity, imagination, intuition into that flow of education, whether you learn or you teach, that's how we're going to actually empower people, to empower the younger generation. And for Barry, definitely there's a link with being a child and not losing completely track of it. And that's, I think, is creativity within the education system.
Yeah,
So we're talking about the need. Sorry, Brian. We're talking about the need then for unlearning for a lot of adults. In terms of taking things away. Emptiness is like we need to like declutter the our mind. I mean, something that occurs to me on this theme of control is there's this brilliant phrase that I picked up from a novel. Where did I pick it up? I think it was from the Good Soldier Švec, actually. It was just like this very famous Czech satire. And it's actually a Thomas à Kempis quote that people might know, which is "Man proposes, but God disposes." Or the Jewish version of that is "Man decides and God laughs."
Yeah,
and which I love, I love him better. And what I love about that is that I'm somebody who I'm a bit of a worrier, and in terms of giving up emptiness, what I'd like to give up is a type of worry, and the worry is feeling that I'm responsible, or I can affect the outcome, and then it doesn't happen, and then oh my word, all these things are happening. I don't want them to happen. I try. I then have this crisis of confidence where I feel powerless. And I had an old.
Imagine how God feels.
Yeah, exactly. I had an old boss and mentor, Jatin, and Jatin used to tell me something I found extremely helpful, which I forget sometimes. I should remember. He said, "Always do the right thing, but don't expect the right outcome." So again, it's the Thomas à Kempis type of thing, and I have to remember that, because that's the thing. There is such capacity for us to worry about all of this complexity that we either is happening or it was always happening and we're newly exposed to it. But that's a lot of burden to be on our individual shoulders, and it's like, as humans, can we really cope with that? We have to try our best, but we also have to let go a sense of having a certain amount of control over the outcomes.
Don't you think that's also antithetical to systems approach anyway? You can't be the system. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Barry.
I wrote in the chat that us trying to get through this, whatever this is, through thinking, is like trying to push the ocean through a pinprick. Like, just let go. Like, it ain't happening. Cognition has a contribution.
Everyone needs to learn to swim. Everyone needs to learn to swim.
With the dolphins.
Yeah.
Well, Valerie makes a really good point around saying that companies are looking at how they are benefiting still, and will they actually rethink or reimagine until there's the upside of cost. And it comes back to that piece that we talked about earlier around, being profit driven. But to your point, Barry, the thinking in some cases actually needs to start. We need to start thinking, as opposed to stop thinking and allow the system just to carry it forward as it has done for many years. We've kind of walk through a lot of change, and now we're at a point where the universe has said, wake up, this is it, this is your wake up moment, this is your time to get up and think and do it differently. And I think collectively we can agree that if we're going to look at radical emptiness, that radical emptiness has to deliver a new solution at some point. That needs to be.
Are we metric for radical emptiness? The metric for radical emptiness.
That's right.
So
what we've got to do
in 6 months' time.
So what we've done is we have worked out, some of us have worked out rather ingeniously that we can get paid for it, which is pretty cool. But can we measure it? That's tough.
It's sort of modern wisdom somehow. There's something to relearn, something to learn, something very different type of wisdom.
Well, Anne Marie said it around creativity. You can't measure anything that's truly beautiful. So
that's so bloody true, Barry.
Well, I think we can. I think this is the Barry pause thing. When I get in front of a piece of art or I hear a piece of music, I'm going to hit a button because I won't be able to articulate what I'm experiencing. I'm just feeling the sense of awe, right? So I'm going to go to the "oh my God" button, and that's going to extract the context of that spiritual sort of slap in the face, and I'm going, okay, those are the things that cause awe in me.
Yeah.
Is that
happy moment?
It's a tool. It's a tool. It's not that I think about education as putting more painting, more music, more whatever is creative. It's actually the tool that makes you creative, and that's how you can learn, because you put it inside, and because you use your talent, you recreate it, and that's how you learn. For instance, a song. Otherwise, the song is not yours. So I think education should be the same. You should own it and put it back out there.
So we're pretty much getting up to our allotted time. So what we need to do is trying to get this nothingness 747 back onto the runway, and in a way that it maintains its presence.
Very good.
Particularly for their passengers. I'm trying. I said I'd try this week. So I'd like to kind of, just wondering if there's like a few. I just thought I'd go round, the group and just sort of, take us through a few closing thoughts. So, Amma, active listening or mentally undressing?
Mentally undressing.
Brian, what wouldn't you do?
What wouldn't I do about what? I don't know the context. I missed the context because I have an unstable piece of technology in my life.
So, Caroline, are we reforming your need for activity and noise, or are you still going to stick to what you like?
I don't want noise. I do want clarity. And I do want the space to find that clarity, which I assume is my version of emptiness.
And Anne-Marie, what's the musical response to our topic?
It's to remember that a good piece of music always includes silence.
Very good. Yeah.
Pause.
And so Barry's internet connection is speaking for him at the moment. So Lou, any final thoughts from you? Can we even discuss nothingness in a way that makes sense?
Yes, we can. We have to avoid the old radio definition of silence, and that is dead air. And have it be far more constructive. It's not dead air. And we experienced it on this episode probably about 45 minutes ago, where the 8 of us were silent for probably 3 or 4 seconds, and it probably seemed an eternity to those who may have been viewing.
And Dave, what's the deeper truths that you think we may have stumbled upon?
That's I'm not sure about the deeper truths, but what I'm appreciating in this moment is when Barry talks about thoughtlessness and thought, I think that can't be overemphasized. This kind of distinction, the distinction that Barry's made, I'm appreciating. Even if you've been on a mountain and studying this for years, it always creates a fresh ripple, and I was appreciating that from Barry.
So just on cue, Barry's internet has gone down yet again, so I'm going to try and wait and see if I can get him back on. So this is his persistence.
I think Barry's moving in and out of emptiness.
Yeah. So while your internet connection has answered for you, Barry. But do you want the last word, and then I'll just do a quick close and talk about next week's show.
No.
You're on, Barry.
Thing. No. Thing. No.
No thing.
Brilliant. Jeremy's just adding that silence is tumescent, which is pretty good. I don't know what tumescent means, but I'm sure you're right, Jeremy. But maybe we'll do a show on tumescence next year. So we're pretty much out of time. So I'd like to thank Amma, Brian, Caroline, Anne-Marie, Lou, Dave, and Barry. Thank you very much for everybody who's stuck with us, talk about nothing, and given us some excellent points. So really appreciate that. Next week's show is about Red Team. What was it? Red Team Lies. So that's going to be with Ben Ford and others. So I'm going to be really interested to find out what Ben's got planning for that. I know what a red team is, but I don't know what the lies angle is. So I'm looking forward to it. I've posted the links to that. But that's pretty much all we've got time for. So yeah, thanks to StreamYard for creating a great platform. And yeah, I've been your host, Chris Patton, and we can stay on here as well for a little bit of green room time afterwards because everybody jumps off. And that's all we've got time for. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.